What we'd like to talk about for this conversation is some of the security and privacy challenges around the gig economy. For entrepreneurs, this has been a very, very big topic. We've seen the rise of many, many large companies, some of the more well-known ones like Uber and Airbnb and Lyft, some of the ride-sharing and hotel-sharing types of services. But there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these kinds of companies and many, many more in the wings that are starting up. And while these services are nimble, provide great flexibility for customers and for workers, there's a lot of security and privacy challenges around these businesses and how they work. And so what we'd like to do is talk today a little bit about all of that. And what we'll start with here for our first piece of it, and I'll start with Gerhard, let's discuss a little bit for customers. There's obviously, it's very easy to get these apps downloaded. It's very easy to use these services. What kind of challenges do companies have for protecting their customers' data? And the kinds of measures that they should be looking at considering to secure that information and build some credibility with their customers that things are safe.
Right. Well, I think the way I look at it is there is really always a trio of individuals involved in this gig economy. It's on the one side, it's the customer who is the beneficiary of whatever service or application. It's the company that provides that particular service, and then there is the individual or the consultant who may be providing services. And I want to define consultant very broad here, because really it's not just an individual. Sometimes it's a vendor, and sometimes it's a consultant, sometimes it's a temporary worker. So there's different kind of flavors of those who are providing the services individually to the company and then respectively to the customer. And I think the key is, of course, how do you understand and make sure that those temporary workers who are coming in and out there, some of them are in for maybe a day, some of them are in for a week, for a month, for a year, various different types of engagement models. How as a company, how do you actually make sure that you're providing a working environment for that individual that is secure, not only to protect your own intellectual property as a company, but also to protect the users, the customers' data, so to say. So providing all of those facets is quite a complex environment, as we all have experienced over the past 2 or 3 years, as this became so popular in terms of growing that business model for companies. And I want to talk a little bit later maybe about some of the way how we can tackle some of those problems. But it's inevitable and it's critical that we have the right technology measures in place, but there's also going to be some legal requirements also, because even if you outsource some of your work to a temporary worker, the regulatory requirements are still your problem. You're not going to outsource those regulatory problems. You're not pushing that out to somebody else. So you're still stuck with some of those issues that you need to face.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing in some cases those regulatory challenges are different country to country, or even in the United States here, state to state, as legislative bodies are trying to wrap some laws around this. So it's a constantly changing thing for businesses that are trying to work in these kinds of models.
Absolutely. It's not only growing and changing, but it's also very different depending on where you're doing business. If you're doing business in Europe, of course, you have a lot more and additional requirements than when you're confined to just doing business here in the US. So certainly, I think that landscape is a fairly complex landscape, and you almost need a team of legal advisors and policy advisors that really help you navigating through some of those jungles and that fast-moving and fast-evolving environment there.
Joe, you have some thoughts here about the security and privacy concerns around this, as Gerhard said, the 3 kind of sets of data that these companies are wrestling with.
Yeah, I think when you step back, you realize that as long as we've been using the internet, the gig economy has been around. I worked at eBay for almost 7 years, and in my mind, eBay was the start of the gig economy, because we were managing a multi-sided marketplace between sellers and buyers, and a large percentage of those sellers on eBay were small businesses, people operating out of their home, doing it on the side. And we wrestled back then with the same issues I dealt with as an advisor at Airbnb and as an employee at Uber, when you're the large company in the middle between these small businesses and consumers, you're trying to figure out how you can support all of them and make it a safe transaction experience. Two main things I've seen that have been consistently a challenge for over 20 years of gig economy on the internet. Number one is we as the tech companies overestimate the ability of our customers to manage the technology. A lot of the times when someone is signing up to be an Uber driver or to sell on eBay or to list their home on Airbnb, it's their first time using a computer. Like signing up as an Uber driver, they might be using a phone for the first time in a lot of countries. And so asking them to go through the user experience that we've designed for smartphone users in Silicon Valley and giving them tips and all of that, it's just not working. And so we as companies need to do a better job of understanding our customers and designing for their actual risks and helping them through them, number one. But number two, there's always been this tension between what the law says that big company in the middle should do and what you want to do from the security standpoint. From a legal standpoint, the companies don't want to reach over and put their arm around the seller or the driver or the host and say, here are all the things you should do and let me help you do them all, because then it becomes an employment relationship or something like that. And the lawyers get very anxious about that. So on the security side, we're like, we want to give them all the tools, and you're just not sure where that line is.
Yeah, I think in the information security side of things, at least in my experience in my career, and I've come out through the government agencies in my past, it's the cliche about compliance is not security, security is not compliance. Just because there's a regulatory checkbox to manage doesn't necessarily mean you're secure. And we get caught up in that conundrum in a lot of cases. And it sounds like what you're saying, this is one of those kinds of places where the legal identification of what employment means or what an employee means starts to drive the decisions that then affect your security parameters, your security conditions of that.
Yeah, and another complexity is, something Gerhard said was that usually it's not just one company that's managing these marketplaces. So, an Uber driver is also frequently a Lyft driver, is also frequently a food delivery with a third-party service. And so they're managing multiple apps and multiple relationships. And one company might have information that is helpful in terms of risk, but it can't really share it with the other companies. I always remember in 2002, or I think it was 2002 or 2003, when I was at eBay, we acquired PayPal. And the first team to merge between eBay and PayPal was the fraud investigations team that I oversaw, got together with the PayPal team. And so I got them all in a room and I said, I want to introduce you to each other. And they said, Joe, we've been meeting in a bar for months talking about fraud patterns because even though the companies were competing, we needed to get together to protect our customers. And I was like, don't tell me. but the members of the security teams at these companies that were competing cared so much, they were collaborating even when the companies were killing each other.
So maybe I'll ask this of Gerhard. What do you think then companies, if you're new, if you're trying to start up a business, you've seen the models work, you're interested in trying to spin something like this up, and you have this very significant security concern, well, on multiple fronts, but this one in particular about the data, your proprietary data may be being used in other ways and other competitors, whatnot. Where does someone begin? Where do you start to build some protections for yourself?
Yeah, that's a really good question. If you think about it, the Uber driver scenario that we talked about before here is one aspect, but then think about the gig economy also in other spaces like software engineering. And lots of companies are using consultants today for various specific projects, consulting projects to develop a particular software module. Well, guess what? That expert that you are hiring is probably highly in demand by your competitors as well. So how do you make sure as a company now that you're hiring those consultants that you're providing an environment, a working environment that's secure, so that your intellectual property or any data that you provide access to is not accidentally ending up at your competitors' hands. And I think that's a pretty significant challenge. For example, how do you make sure as a company that those devices that the consultants are using are adhering to your security policies. It's very common for a consultant to come in with their own devices, with their own laptops, with their own computers, with their own phones. Well, you have no control over those devices. You have no visibility into those devices. Are they patched to the latest possible state, or are they kind of a little bit outdated? And a little bit outdated means bad news already. So the question is, do you have a way to enforce with your gig economy workers that they are only using your own devices that are adhering to your own security policies? And that's one of the things I've seen in larger organizations gravitating towards, is that you are, if you are looking into a consultant worker, that you're providing her or him the working environment, the working equipment, the computer, the laptop, the phone, and whatnot. They're essentially to provide a similar consistent security framework that you have it in place for your other employees, because why would you spend all your money and time on your regular employees and your full-timers while you have the door wide open on the consultancy side? And you can think this even further. I mean, that, like the software engineering example that we just used here. So now you give that individual your own policy-based device that is adhering to your own security policies, but now you need to give that individual access to your source code tree. Well, how do you limit that access on the source code tree for that individual to be productive and providing kind of source code check-ins, but at the same time don't give him unlimited access to your source code? And so I think those are some of the considerations that I've been tackling within the last probably 2.5, 3 years specifically. How do you deal with some of those challenges? How do you come up with technological solutions that are not just based purely on legal contracts and paperwork? How do you actually make it work? And not necessarily saying this is easy, but I think it's super important for this gig economy to work.
Joe, do you have some thoughts about expanding on that and any other ways to secure some of this?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to security principles, it's always back to the basics. And so making sure that the machines, like what do us as security leaders think about? We think about the endpoints, are they secure? And like Gerhard said, when you have a workforce that's not made up of employees under your corporate umbrella, it becomes a lot harder to manage all those devices and what's happening on them.
Yeah, and I would like to add, if I may, I mean, I think one of the challenges, especially for small businesses that are coming up, is that security as a concept or even as a team is generally several steps down the road of what gets implemented or what gets brought on board. It's sometimes an afterthought. And it's been very common for me. I've seen cases where a CEO or a CFO has outsourced some sort of IT function and they believe that their contract is the sole protection they need for their environment. I mean, when I've had a CEO look at me and say, well, we gave them a domain admin credential, but they won't use it because we told them only to manage our mail servers. Well, but you gave them the keys to the kingdom. They have everything, right? So I think there's a perception change that has to happen for business leaders to be mindful of the security aspects as well and not rely solely on the legal protections or the regulatory protections. You need to make sure even at day one that you're taking these kind of more technical security concerns at play. Even if you're not necessarily the expert, it needs to be part and parcel of your business. So let me ask then this next question about this. So obviously we've touched a little bit on the regulations. They're changing pretty dramatically. GDPR in the EU is making some headway there. We're seeing that kind of thing happen here in the United States. There's some more conversations about it. Federal laws coming about privacy in this regard. Do you think there's going to need to be some changes to these laws due to the way these gig economies scale and the way that they work, especially as we get into places like China and India and other large population countries where you're not talking about a few 100,000 people involved, you're talking millions or more. Do you think the regulatory bodies need to start addressing some of this as these services grow?
Well, I think you have always in that environment more risk of regulatory fragmentation than what you'd like to have. I think the European Union actually has, in my opinion, shown a great example of a privacy-related regulation that I think is actually a really great start. And what I hope is that we're not seeing now in various other places appearing regulatory requirements for privacy that are entirely different, entirely orthogonal, but rather than be consistent with what's been asked already from the European Union. And I think while we're talking about a V1 here, I think there will be certainly some evolution to it, and there's already some evidence of evolution coming. But I do think it's really critical that the leaders in the different countries and places are coordinating some of those regulatory requirements, because otherwise it becomes an almost impossible thing to implement. I think it was hard enough. It was really hard enough to implement the GDPR. Even I'm a huge fan of GDPR. I think it is one of the really most sensible regulation in bringing privacy to the individuals and to the users. So I'm a huge fan of it. The implementation part was hugely difficult. And I do know that many are still struggling, especially some of the more mid-sized companies who may not have all the resources and talent to do it, are still struggling there to get to a sensible implementation of GDPR. But I think it's an important part. I think it's a very good thing. I think it's something that is, even in the gig economy, going to be critical and important. But I really hope that we are not ending up with 15 or 20 different regulations that we all need to kind of coordinate.
Absolutely. Joe, I want to come back to a point very quickly here about this. You know, the user experience you mentioned, the UI UX piece of this. I think that's something that doesn't get brought up very often, and I'm quite glad you did. But again, there's challenges around the security and privacy aspects of that. When you make something maybe too easy, are you building enough controls in the back end of it to make sure that everything's secure? Same with your developers. If your developers aren't maybe on board with secure coding principles, or building these things in mind with that at core, you could potentially make this a very simple application to break. Someone could hack it, so to speak. Hate using that term, but for simplicity's sake. What's some of your thoughts about how to bridge that gap between ease of use, strong development, but still making it secure?
Well, I think it's really important when you think about the gig economy to remember that we're talking about commercial transactions, and so where a lot of money and effort is being spent is on the fraud and abuse side. We tend to think about it from like a hacking standpoint, but what's like if you're talking to the drivers, the hosts, they're under attack right now by organized criminal groups, because they're getting paid into a so if you can compromise a host's account, you can go in and change where the weekly payment goes to, and then if you can do that at scale, you can steal a lot of money really quickly. And so that was the case with eBay back in the day. Phishing against sellers was much more of a problem than phishing against buyers, because sellers controlled financial accounts and they were linked to their underlying. And so in the gig economy, fraud and that type of abuse is a really big pain point. And even if you take it to the scooter context, now they're seeing the same issues around fraud, because in the same way with the ride sharing, in the scooter context, the big companies are paying money out to workers, so someone has to go get the scooters every night and move them to a certain place and recharge them. What if they didn't actually move the scooters and they didn't actually recharge them, but the company was paying out? So there's a lot of fraud and risk challenges right now in the gig economy as well. And that's an area that I haven't seen a lot of innovation supporting those companies, but a lot of risk and challenges are happening right now.
What do you think some of the kind of innovations were, especially for automation or technology, supporting those fraud efforts? What kind of things do we need to see? I mean, I would say from my experience, most fraud units come out of some sort of banking system, and they are very archaic. They're very, process oriented. That's very long lead times into dealing with situations. What would you see some recommendations for how to address that?
What's most exciting in this space is the convergence of the digital and physical world. Like in security, we've been talking forever about, like, could we use real world data to help with fraud on the internet? Forever people have been trying to do machine ID and things like that. But now you can add in GPS data, you can add in, privacy issues aside, the more data you have on what's going on in the real world, the better. You talk about being able to build real models to detect abuse. That is where the innovation's happening right now, the combination of physical world and digital signals. So it's not just kind of like, let's analyze that email address and the IP address and their pattern of transactions. It's let's look at other context. And I think that's where it's very interesting right now.
Do you, I'll turn this back over to Gerhard. Do you see, in a sense, this kind of model for fraud protection in these services becoming its own sort of gig economy platform where some of the major companies may provide this service as a hosted SaaS model or something to that effect? What do you see in that regard?
I think in theory, some of the pieces of data are probably going to be super valuable would be super valuable to others as well. I mean, there's all kinds of privacy questions and issues involved here that probably will make this a very difficult proposition to actually launch a business on that. But I do think, as Joe was just saying here, I think the beauty of the model is that those providers of those gig economy or the companies that are providing the services, they have all the signals and the data centrally already. I mean, they basically have it all. It's about finding that needle in the haystack, and that's where I think some of the future work will be happening. And it's a great use case for some machine learning capabilities that are very appropriate for those cases. So I do think there is going to be some businesses that probably will be helping developing products, fraud detection products for those companies. But I'm less sure if this is a gig economy business because I think there's going to be a lot of sensitivity to that data, and I think companies would behoove themselves to keep the data probably fairly centralized.
Yeah, it would be nice if we saw the equivalent of a Volvo in this context, meaning a company that puts safety and security first as a brand thing, and how well they could differentiate. Like, it seems like there's this thing happening right now where companies are trying to like wrap themselves around the privacy mantle, but in the gig economy context, safety on the consumer side, safety is paramount, and on the provider, driver, host side, I think financial security is paramount. And so, which company is going to step up and say we're putting you first on each side? Like, I think if you go back and study that again, like the eBay example, eBay versus Amazon during that time period of the late 90s, early 2000s. I mean, Amazon runs marketplace. A lot of the time when we buy things on Amazon right now, we're not buying from Amazon. We're buying from the people who used to sell on eBay. And why are we more comfortable doing that on Amazon? Because Amazon came out with these ironclad return policies and guarantees for us as consumers. Like, Amazon doesn't wave that flag, but they delivered on a promise of safety for us as consumers. And so who's next in the gig economy to step up and deliver that?
Well, I think one of the most important turns I'm seeing for information security as a discipline is that I think people are finally starting to understand that it's not really a technology discipline, it's a risk discipline. That we're a risk management mitigation function. We use technology to help mitigate that risk and help protect data and people and whatnot. But it really is more of a risk-based practice. And in my experience, I'm seeing companies actually start to embrace that and use it even as a marketing effort in the way you're talking about, to say that we take this stuff seriously and it's being seen as a selling point for their service, for their product, whatever the case might be. So I think, for business owners or someone who's looking to get into these kinds of businesses, I would certainly advocate turn that into a selling point. Use it as a reason why people should come and do business with you, is that you take their data seriously, you take their safety seriously, that you will protect them, their business, whatever the case is. I think that's a real strategy that people can employ, provided, of course, they actually do the security work that they need to do. So, at any rate, so I think we're getting down to just a couple of minutes left here. Want to just wrap up with any last thoughts from both of you about what this whole business model. I mean, this is not going anywhere anytime soon. I think even with some of the challenges from the laws that are coming in for the employee-employer relationship, as that gets further defined, we're not going to see these go away anytime soon. What do you recommend for the owners or for the folks that are building these kinds of businesses? What do they need to be focusing on strategically from a security perspective? Gerhard?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's definitely not going to go away. I think it's going to grow substantially. It's probably one of the fastest growing economies from an employment perspective. And we will have to deal with it if we like it or not. And I think to me, it's about when I think about it, what are some of the key cornerstones to success? Is as you're onboarding and offboarding those folks, and there's a lot of transactions here, a lot of onboarding, offboarding that's involved there. You got to be able to make those onboarding, offboardings not only efficient and effective, but also secure, so that you know the identity of those folks that are really onboarding, so that you don't onboard somebody who may be a different person than what you think about there. So I think there's a lot of that. Secondarily, providing the equipment. I do think this is going to happen down the road. I think you're not going to likely be in a position of securing a personal equipment of an individual. So I think you got to be in a position where you have to provide the working equipment, that being the endpoint, the workstation, the mobile phone, whatever is required for that individual to be effective is probably a critical requirement. And then thirdly, that's one of my things, is how do you really manage internally as an organization your access controls? Because I mean, if it's a driver for your drive sharing company, that individual needs very limited, confined access to your intellectual property, probably nothing. They probably need access to some fairly limited usage data. But then if you have a software engineer as a gig economist working for your organization, you have a very different scenario. So I think that control, that access control, I think you gotta make that really easy, because otherwise it's getting so complex that you can't manage it well.
That's great. Joe, very, very quickly, as we have no time left, but any last thoughts here for us?
I 100% agree with this idea of identity and access management is if you did a survey of people running security at the 100 largest companies in the world, they would say it's their biggest headache. And for the smallest companies in the world, it's their biggest headache. When you start talking about the gig economy and the decentralized workforces and the consumer side, it's the biggest headache. And it comes down to that tension between experience, creating like that onboarding experience that's smooth, versus one that ensures that no one else can take over that account. That's hard.
Yeah, I mean, as we've been saying for a long time, identity is the new perimeter, right? It's not firewalls or anything else. It's really about who's on the other side of the work. So, great, everyone. Thank you very much. We are at time, but I want to thank Gerhard and Joe for their insight today. If any of you have any questions, we'll be available here this afternoon. So please come say hi and have a chat. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.